Hello, and thank you for attending. Welcome to our second podcast in a series sponsored by Hope House, a facility where we try to help people help themselves. Today, our topics will be co-presented by Dr. Mike Swadowick. He'll be talking about trauma, memory, and grief. I'll be presenting some concepts on grief, about how the body holds grief, or how a person does not recognize when the body's holding grief, and how that interferes and impacts with our day. So I'll turn it over to Mike to start the day. Dr. Swadowick.
Thank you, Ray. Hello, everybody. The topic, how I arrived at what I wanted to talk about today, happened a few days. Well, actually, it happens all the time. My wife and I love music, so we're sitting around listening to a song that'll just come on the radio, come on YouTube, and she'll know all the words to the song that she heard 35 years ago. And she goes, "How does that happen?" And I said, "I don't know." And I did some investigative reporting and found out that it's all part of a memory. And we have several different areas of memory, none of which I'll get into right now because it's too technical, and that's Ray's area. But to me, it's akin to a file cabinet. And so M for music, I have a lot of stuff in that file cabinet. G for grief is I'm adding every day. And T for trauma, again, it's being added to every day. But every one of those files has something in it because of my memory. And I read an article that someone said something happened to them when they were 4 years old, and they couldn't understand why they remembered what happened when they were only 4. And this woman, I believe, was 58 years old. I'm older than that, and I just want to give you 2 or 3 examples of what I'm talking about. And the first one is, well, that's not a memory. I was born with a cleft palate, and back in the olden days, that was a big deal. And so I had 5 operations before I was 5 years old to repair this cleft palate, all of which I had to go to the hospital for every one, obviously. But I remember after one of them, I was laying in my bed, and I was really sore because of the operation, et cetera, and the nurse whispered to my mom and dad, "Sneak away, because if you say goodbye, he's going to start crying, and that's not good for the stitches in his mouth." And I have no idea why I remember that. And the other one, actually there might be 2 more. The other one is when I was getting these series of operations, I had a stuffed animal I used to take with me, a stuffed teddy bear. His name was Gregory. So I would always have Gregory in bed with me and in the hospital with me. And I remember laying on the gurney going into the operating room, and the nurse said, "You can't take Gregory in the operating room with you, so we'll keep an eye on him for you. When you get out, he'll be here." And when I got out, he wasn't there, and I didn't know what to do. It was my first real form of separation, I guess, separation anxiety. I know he might still be at the hospital. I have no idea where he went. And it was always curious to me, how do I remember that? And sometimes during the course of conversations, people would get mad at me, like, "How do you remember who the warm-up band was at a concert we saw 35 years ago?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I just do." And so I also learned in this pursuit of memory, for example, getting back to the song example, the memory article I read said, you associate good times with that memory. So it brings back pleasant times. It brings back fun. It brings back a time of your life when you were hop, skipping, and jumping down the road. And that's why you remember it. Now, on the other hand, there's trauma. And why do you kind of remember trauma for the same reasons, only it was such a dramatic time in your life, it's etched in your memory forever. So as we continue on, we'll add more to this particular subject, but I was fascinated by that whole thing about how do I remember these things? And it's there, it's your brain at work, and that's that, right?
Well, the grief brings up a lot of memory. And if people don't handle the grief properly, that'll stay with them for a long time. And there's a checklist that we utilize with people, which talk about the ways grief shows up in the body. They call it the anatomy of grief. Number 1, it affects the brain. because of the intense stresses and the threat response. There's parts of the brain, the amygdala, which is behavior and mood, the hippocampus, which is memory. There's a great research article which studied, unfortunately, women who had passed, but women who had been sexually assaulted and raped. Their hippocampus was 28% times larger than a normal person under an autopsy. So that just tells you that the body holds that. Number 2, the heart. The heart swells up and it increases in its heart rate, which basically is a broken heart syndrome. People have talked about that for years, but now science has proven that happens. And it happens a lot with spouses. When one spouse passes, there's a 21% times higher chance that next spouse may pass within the next 24 hours. And I've had 2 good older family friends happen this year. Crying, tears are a healer, but there's 3 types of tears. There's the basal tears, which moisturize our eyes. There's the, reflexive, which is a response to an irritant. You get something in your eye, your eyes tear up. But the most important one is the emotional tears. Those are really significant tears. And they're finding that some animals have the same type of sequence. Walruses, elephants, they feel that they have tears of sadness. Decreased pleasure, loss or increase of appetite. That happens quite a bit. Difficulty sleeping or insomnia, they don't feel that they get enough sleep. They get 10 hours sleep, they still wake up tired. Also, temporary weakness of the immune system, where many times after a situation, you're just sick. People just get sick one way or another, and there's no really explanation for it. Headaches and body aches, that happens quite a bit, just unexplained pains. And then the somatic pain that goes through the body. You have a pain in some area of your body which you really can't explain. So those are the ways that grief shows up in your body. And that's the trauma, which trickles down to the grief. There's a timeline that people can utilize to try to help doing that. Talk therapy. Aerobic exercise is huge in terms of people with trying to heal. Friends and support systems, whether it's a therapist, a group, somebody, your priest, holy man, rabbi, someone that you feel confident, content with, and then recalling the memories. So if you're working with a person who's really stuck in that grief where it's overtaken their body, I always tell people as a counselor, you listen with 3 ears. Number 1, you listen what people are saying. Number 2, more importantly, you listen what people are not saying. And number 3, you listen to what people want to say. So you look for themes, especially with people that have been abused and traumatized. You look for themes that are going on in their life. One of the quotes I like to leave with people, especially the counselors, is don't die with the music still in you. And Mike let this off about how important that music was. But we all have music in us and a story. And Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
The third example, I just remembered when Ray was speaking that I only gave 2. And the third one was in the olden days, when you got operations, they used this anesthetic called ether. And ether smells like rubber. So every time I would go into a hardware store, the hardware stores are not around so much anymore, but it would smell, the plungers and that smell of rubber would trigger how I felt. The operations were never fun. And so I would have to leave the hardware store, not because I was being a crazy person, I just couldn't stand that smell. And based on that, there's also something we'll get into, I'm sure, later on in podcasts called triggers. And sometimes where you are, a word someone might say, a picture you might see can trigger traumatic response. And I didn't know that either. And once you learn that this is a trigger, it's easier to deal with. And basically, that's it about triggers. Traumatic experience is etched in our brain forever. And as I get into some other things this morning, what I wanted to talk about was my favorite person, Alice Miller, she's a psychologist who talks about unresolved trauma. And that's kind of what the theme of this is this memory thing is unresolved trauma. And if you don't learn how to deal with your unresolved issues, it's going to haunt you forever. And I think my mom never got over my father. I think Alice Miller would have loved my mother, because she told me when she was in her early 80s, I never got over your father. And she was like 24 or 25 or whenever that happened. And I was like, really? And she's not alone, and neither are a lot of us. And so when I was young, hang on a minute here. When I was young, I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know what was sad or what wasn't sad. I knew what was sad because I saw my mom crying, and I knew things were different. I just got used to the feeling. So we lived like martyrs. We lived in a world that everybody was better than us, because that's what unresolved trauma does. It kills your self-worth. You just feel like, I don't know, I don't deserve anything. So as a result, if you live I'm convinced that you do not make your best decisions when you don't feel well about yourself. You just do bad things, and you don't even realize they're bad. And without this information I'm conveying today, it's amazing. You just live with it, and you don't know what to do. So Ray and I talk about alcohol abuse. I was a big drinker in college. It was a way to get along with everybody. It was a way to make new friends and drink more than anybody else and all that sort of thing. And I was at a party one time at my house, and it was a room full of people, and everybody's having a grand old time. And all of a sudden, this feeling hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was partying all day, and this trauma thing came up in me. This sadness came up in me, this feeling of low self-worth. I'm like, how can this happen? And I didn't know what to do with it. I was in my 20s, so I learned to live with it. And it's not a pleasant experience when you think, not only are you living with this sort of trauma, but when you think everybody's better than you, you think nobody has this trauma but you. And I really firmly believe that our family never acknowledged the extent of what happened to us. And as a result, nobody dealt with it. I just felt like somehow I was the only one. Nobody's dad did this or nobody's mom did that. It was just mine. And as a result, what comes down the chute is everybody's better than you. And that's a really tough way to live your life, because you always have to do these things to prove that you are, no matter what they are. They might be gambling, they might be drug use, they might be sex, they might be a lot of things. But how it manifests itself is exhausting. And my nickname in the old days was people pleaser, because I'd always want to just make everybody around me happy, safe, secure, and I would do that at my own expense. It was almost like a clown situation, and I didn't know how to get out of that. I didn't know how to get out of that situation until I started doing this work. And I learned that it just wasn't me. It was the complete lack of dealing with grief and trauma. And just pretending like that's the way it goes. Have a nice day. And I went on my merry way. Right?
We're talking about dealing with that trauma, dealing with grief. Dr. Peter Levine, tremendous psychologist who I've been following for years, he boils it down to three different areas. First one is called pendulation. Just think of a pendulum. You swing one way, you swing the other way. So he says you lean into grief and your emotions and trauma, and then you lean out. But the bottom line is you don't have to be sad all the time. The second one is resourcing. Having people, support personnel, counselor, therapist, group counseling, some type of program that helps you deal with it and work through it. And the last one is titration, which really is the old chemistry class word. Doing things in small doses, facing the pain and dealing with it, and then pendulating back out. So you can titrate that way, titrate those feelings that way. The other thing that is really important is to help others recognize when they're not dealing with the grief. A lot of different ways that they do it. Mike had mentioned one or two. But number one, compulsive behavior, eating, spending, gambling, many times it's self-destructive behavior, and you're just kidding yourself by avoiding it. Number 2 is withdrawal from relationships. You become a loner, become the lone wolf, or the crazy old man that nobody wants to be around. Number 3, overfunctioning, avoiding by pretending. You pretend it didn't happen, so you throw yourself into your work, into your play, into your addiction if you have one. 4th is irritability. You're always on edge, seem to be always in a bad mood. Sleep issues we talked about earlier, but there's a real interesting concept I found online. Some things online are just a waste of time, but there's some stuff online by some tremendous teachers. But there's one which just I live by, and it's difficult. I wake up every day at 3 o'clock. It doesn't matter, alarm clock or not, school or not, I'm retired. If I'm going fishing or not, I'm up at 3. And there's a tremendous program on the internet about what it means when you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and basically it all revolves around grief. So that's an interesting if you can ever pull that up and find it. Physical symptoms, there's a great book by Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the top names in trauma. The body keeps score. Everything that happens to you, one way or another, it's just a little nick. It's almost like that torture, that paper cut torture. What is it called? 1,000 cuts. After 1,000, you can't handle it anymore. And then mental health symptoms increase a little bit. And and you got to ask yourself, and if you are blind to it or oblivious to it because you really don't want to face it, hopefully you have someone close to you who will just point that out in the right time and say, hey, Dr. Mike, have you thought of this? Or have you looked at this? Or can you explain this kind of behavior, what you're doing? You don't need to be around these people who want to make you feel like the clown all the time, and you don't want to be around these people who never have a good thing to say. It's just constantly sticking the knife in, or constantly aggravating you. Remove yourself from those situations. In terms of the healing too, there's a few things you can do. Number 1, make sleep a priority. Good sleep. Figure out how you can get yourself and your body and your mind ready for sleep. Good, clean nutrition. Try to stay away from all the additives that are in a lot of the foods that we eat. Good social connections. People that are like consciousness. Not that you want to be around people who constantly agree with you, but people who have the same thoughts and ideas. And the other one is, there's 2 more really. One is enriching activities. What do you do to help others? What kinds of things, what kinds of activities do you do to go beyond yourself, to see that there's something bigger than yourself? And the last one is some belief in some type of spirituality. Where does that play a part in your healing, in your role of healing? Mike?
Before Ray and I got here today, we were talking about various ways of healing and various things to do to make us feel better about what's going on. And one of them for me is talking, writing, there's music. And when I was a house painter, it was art, because people had asked me to do things in their house I had never done before. And I just told them I could do it because I didn't want them to hire somebody else. And I said, close the door and leave me alone, and I could do it. And it was like my heart was speaking through my hands. And I had this in me, and now it's starting to manifest itself at this part of my life. And a reason for that is Ray and I were just talking. And we talk on the phone, and what's going on. We might start talking about a baseball, and all of a sudden we end up here. And Ray talked about tears. I never remember crying for my father. I cried because everybody else cried. And it's so weird because it was never able to get out of me. I had to manifest it through sports. I remember when I was little, I would always go outside and play rubber ball off the stairs by myself. And I would announce the games. I would pretend I was a Cub announcer or I was the Bears announcer, and I'd make a diving catch and say, oh my God, what a great, I think the neighbors thought I was nuts because I was always by myself. And I remember our family always being, there was my mom, my 2 sisters, my younger brother, and me. We always did things by ourselves. And an example of that is my brother Joe had moved to California many, many years ago, and he came back. And he started painting with me, and I said, I don't know who you are. I know you're my brother. I don't know anything about your life. And to me, that was an indicator of how little we talked. And it was funny, this last memory I'm going to give you today, right before we started, Ray said something about this room reminds him of Fraser Thomas Family Classics. And we're dating ourselves. It's an old show that used to be on Sunday afternoons. And they used to show classics, but they were kid classics. So we were at my grandpa's house the Sunday after the Friday my dad killed himself. And Moby Dick was on Family Classics. And I was sitting there watching the whale movie. And I turned around and both my sisters were crying. And the only reason I cried was they cried. And my Uncle Don came up to me and said, your dad was dead. He said, your dad is dead. And I'm like, what does that mean? I had no idea of the never coming back. I had no idea of a lot of ramifications that would come later on in my life of not having a father. And part of the anxiety and the shame and the guilt I talk about and deals you make with yourself, I found myself looking at families that had a father and wishing I was part of those families. I've had 3 different men in my life tell me you were always part of our family, and that was my goal because I didn't have a dad. I didn't have someone to say, and a lot of people don't have dads. I get that, but for me, I didn't have anybody, try out for the Little League team. Don't let that kid push you around. We were always the kids that got pushed around. And people in my life might say, I never saw that. But in my body, I did. Or in my mind, I did. So, again, I'm feeling like these first 2 episodes, if you will, are real overviews. And what I wanted to do for this overview was take a small portion of my life and say how it applies to me now. Because as my friend Alice Miller says, it was unresolved trauma. She would say things like, you're not born being afraid of elevators. You're not born of being afraid to fly. You learn that through unresolved trauma. And I believe that. And so that's, and also the thing about feeling like you don't deserve anything good. I may be repeating myself, but that's too bad. That's no kidding. You don't think good things can happen to you. You're not going to get picked for the team. You're not going to, people aren't going to ask you out on a date. They're not going to do a lot of things. And as a result, when you live like that, it's like, man, you have to, I felt like for a long time I was overcompensating. And we had a situation in school where my mom was called in to see the teacher, and I thought for sure I was in trouble. And the teacher said, Mike is very, very smart. He's anxious in class because he's really bored. We have to give him more to do. I still didn't believe it. So at any rate, I'll finish up on that one. And Ray?
Mike, before we go, you mentioned something about hands and working with the hands. Mm-hmm. This is a subjective observation I've made over the years, but people in trauma, deep grief, they do a lot with their hands, and I can relate to that because when my son passed years ago, I was doing everything I could with my hands. I do a lot of work with leather, and I was making 20 different things every day. I was staying so busy because it was distracting me from the pain that was there. But those hands, it's good to make and do things and create, and yet you want to make sure that does not get in the way of facing the issues behind helping you heal. That's really important. So we'd like to thank you for listening today. Hope House is a non-for-profit entity and located at 231 West Main Street in Barrington, Illinois. Our services are free. We do accept any type of donations for the various services we have during the course of the year. We work with Native American veterans. We work with what they call the wiping of the tears ceremonies. We'll put 4 of those on each year for people who have lost a loved one, children or a spouse. And we're just there to help people get through this because our view right now as we get older, and Mike and I are quite old, is we got to do something to help these younger generations as well as the older generations. People forget about the 70, 80-year-old veterans that are killing themselves because there's nothing left for them. So we have to help them try to resolve those issues in their life. And at the end of the day, all we can do is our best. And not being religious, but there's many people I pray for every night, including myself. And so our prayers go out to all of you. Anybody who needs healing, please find someone that you are comfortable with. And we look forward to our next section. Thank you.